Are there any members who haven't voted who wish to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 24 ayes and 16 noes.
The ayes have it, and the bill is amended. The bill is reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Without objection, the bill will be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all adopted amendments, and staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes.
Mr. Chairman, just had a quick question.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Just a question of the chairman. Mr. Chairman, just a question on an issue that concerns the committee. It's being reported by the DC Bureau Chief for the Intercept, the gentleman Ryan Grimm. I understand it's not always wise to believe what's said on Twitter, but he's reporting that the Democrats will be introducing legislation to expand the Supreme Court from 9 members to 13 members, and that you and 2 of our members on this committee will be sponsoring that legislation. Is that accurate?
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
That is not the
This
subject.
is not like an appropriate
That is
time to
not
make
the
inquiry
sub-
of the chairman.
That is not the subject of the markup.
Expanding the Supreme
That is
Court,
not the
a
subject
report
of
that
the-
the chairman's going to be
that is
sponsoring
not-
legislation is not something to be talked about on the House Judiciary.
In the middle of a markup.
The gentleman,
I waited till the bill was over,
gentleman
asked the
will
chairman a question.
suspend.
If you don't think it's important about the Democrats trying to expand the
gentleman will
size of the
suspend.
Supreme Court,
pursuant to
I
notice.
think that's a pretty important issue,
Pursuant
Mr.
to notice, I
Cicilline.
now call up H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, for purposes of markup, and move the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The
Will we
clerk
take
will
that as, can we take that
the
as a
clerk
no,
will
you're not
report the bill.
sponsoring that, Mr. Chairman?
H.R. 40, to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States. And the
Without
13th
objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, is historic legislation that would establish a commission to examine the shameful legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in this country and to develop proposals on how we can best move forward as a nation. This legislation is long overdue. For nearly 3 decades, the former chairman of this committee, John Conyers of Michigan, introduced H.R. 40. Our colleague, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, has taken up the sponsorship of this legislation, and I am pleased to be an original co-sponsor. H.R. 40 is intended to begin a national conversation about how to confront the brutal mistreatment of African Americans during chattel slavery, Jim Crow segregation, and the enduring structural racism that remains endemic to our society today. Even long after slavery was abolished, the anti-black racism that undergirded it reflected and defined part of our nation's attitudes, shaping its policies and institutions. Today, we still live with racial disparities in access to education, healthcare, housing, insurance, employment, and other social goods that are directly attributable to the damaging legacy of slavery and government-sponsored racial discrimination. These disparities, in terms of disproportionate burdens on African Americans, have only been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. It is important to recognize that H.R. 40 makes no conclusion about how to properly atone for and make recompense for the legacy of slavery and its lingering consequences. It does not mandate financial payments of any kind, and it does not prejudge the outcome of the Commission's work. Instead, it sets forth a process by which a diverse group of experts and stakeholders can study the complex issues involved and make recommendations. In fact, most serious reparations models that have been proposed to date have focused on reparative, community-based programs of employment, healthcare, housing, and educational initiatives, righting wrongs that cannot be fixed with checks alone. This moment of national reckoning comes at a time when our nation must find constructive ways to confront a rising tide of racial and ethnic division. On January 6th, we saw the ugly confluence of such divisions, as white nationalist groups appeared to be among those playing a central role in the violent assault on the United States Capitol. And we continue to see unarmed black people killed by police at a disproportionate rate, with another tragic death just this week. White nationalism and police community conflict are just part of the long legacy of anti-black racism that has shaped our nation's laws, institutions, and societal attitudes. That racism and division hold back our country's longstanding efforts to carry out what the preamble to the Constitution says it is designed to do, to form a more perfect union. Reparations in the context of H.R. 40 are ultimately about respect and reconciliation, and the hope that one day all Americans can walk together toward a more just future. I hope the commission established by H.R. 40 can help us better comprehend our own history and bring us closer to racial understanding and advancement. The discussion of reparations is a journey in which the road traveled is almost more important than the exact destination. Passing H.R. 40 is an important first step. I am pleased that the Judiciary Committee is beginning this journey today, and I urge all my colleagues to support this important legislation. Before I yield to the ranking member, I want to note that we are all joined in this room by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, and without objection, I will place in the record a letter from her in support of the bill. I now recognize the distinguished ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. $20 million to create a 15-member commission to study reparations. Here's who makes up the commission. President Biden gets to select 3. Senator Leahy gets to select 3. Speaker Pelosi gets to select 3. The remaining 6 are selected by the commissioner, or excuse me, by the commission's director, but they have to come from organizations that support reparations. 15 people spending $20 million of taxpayer money to reach a conclusion we already know what it's going to be. Why the heck do we need to spend $20 million? Why spend the money? We know what these 15 members are going to say. Spend $20 million for a commission that's already decided to take money from people who were never involved in the evil of slavery and give it to people who were never subject to the evil of slavery. That's what Democrats on the Judiciary Committee are doing. Oh, and they won't answer the question. You got a news reporter, the D.C. Bureau Chief, reporting that they would now want to expand the Supreme Court. They won't answer that question. Oh, and all the while we got a crisis on the border. Such a deal for the taxpayer. Such a deal for the American taxpayer. Look, everyone knows how evil slavery was. Wrong as wrong could be. But this is not what we want to be passing. And I do want to get an answer, if the chairman will ever give us one, on if he is going to be sponsoring, if the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee is going to be sponsoring legislation to expand the Supreme Court to 13 members. That's something the American people would like to know, as is being reported by the head of the D.C. Bureau Chief for The Intercept. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the... I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to say that I strongly support H.R. 40. I've been a sponsor of this legislation since I came to Congress in 2007. It was originally sponsored in 1989 by the distinguished former chairman of this committee, Mr. John Conyers, whose picture is on the wall here. An outstanding congressperson and an outstanding chairman. And I hope that this committee will report this out favorably to the full House. The enslavement of people of African ancestry in America was a crime against humanity, the impacts of which we as a society continue to grapple with today, and everything from racially unequal economic opportunities to disparate health outcomes to the plague of unjustified police violence against Black Americans. Slavery was this country's original sin. Our Constitution protected it, embodying various compromises that gave disproportionate power to slave states. The 3/5 clause counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for population counts, which in turn gave disproportionate representation to slave states in the House of Representatives. Otherwise, they were considered as property. They were only considered as persons to give their slave-holding states, political organizations, and teams more power. The Constitution also created an electoral college, a system of electing the President of the United States that gave slave states another avenue to exercise disproportionate influence over national affairs, and only by counting African Americans in some way other than as property to give the slave master and his power structure in that state additional powers over our federal government. It is only fitting then that in the midst of a continuing reckoning over police mistreatment of Black people, a continuing assault on the voting rights of Black citizens, and a pandemic that has disproportionately impacted Black Americans, we should be holding this historic markup of H.R. 40, the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. It is a study to tell us what they propose. We don't know the answer. H.R. 40 would create this commission to study the history of slavery in America, the role of the federal and state governments in supporting slavery and racial discrimination, other forms of discrimination against the descendants of slaves, and the lingering effects of slavery on African Americans. The commission will also make recommendations as to appropriate ways to educate the American public about its findings and appropriate remedies in light of its findings. I applaud Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, the current lead sponsor of this legislation, for her leadership on this bill, and I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor. I also was proud to chair 2 hearings on H.R. 40 before the Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties. I commend Chairman Nadler, another longtime sponsor of this bill, for holding this first ever markup of H.R. 40. But the greatest credit for H.R. 40 belongs to our former colleague and former chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, my friend and mentor, the late John Conyers, Jr. He first introduced this legislation over 30 years ago and reintroduced it in every Congress until his retirement. And for those who may not know, the reason it's H.R. 40 is because John Conyers chose that number. Because Republicans promised 40 acres and a mule to the freedmen. The party of Lincoln said, we will give you 40 acres and a mule. General Sherman, that was a promise, and it would have been fulfilled, and African Americans would have had to step up and had an opportunity not to have the economic deprivations they've had over the years, but for John Wilkes Booth, the assassination of President Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson coming president. An honest reckoning with the federal government's role in protecting the institute of slavery has been a leading priority of my congressional career. In 2007, less than 2 months into my tenure, I introduced H.Res. 194, an apology by the House of Representatives for its role in perpetuating both slavery and its noxious offspring, Jim Crow. The House ultimately passed this resolution by a voice vote, and again, I give credit to Mr. Conyers for bringing it to the floor. As I noted in my resolution, it was not just slavery itself that was wrong, but it was also, quote, the visceral racism against persons of African descent upon which, unquote, American slavery depended, a racism that went on to become, quote, entrenched in the nation's social fabric. This is an evil that we must continue to confront today as our nation still struggles with the legacy of the anti-black racism that undergirded slavery and Jim Crow. We see this in statistics that paint a bleak picture. According to the Census Bureau, 18.8% of black Americans live in poverty in 2019, compared to 7.3% of non-Hispanic whites who live in poverty. The Washington Post reported last year that in 2016, the net worth of black households was $13,024, which was 10% of the $149,703 net worth of non-Hispanic white households. Limited access to wealth-building resources and opportunities have led to this stark disparity. For instance, black Americans continue to face discrimination in the workplace. They also have limited access to educational opportunities. According to the National Education Association, the high school graduation rate for blacks was 67% compared to a nationwide average of 81%. They also continue to face racial segregation in housing, discrimination in the availability and quality health care services, health deserts, and in most other major facets of life. Health deserts, food deserts are common in almost every predominant black neighborhood in our country. The COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the effects of these structural racial disparities. Enacting H.R. 40 will be an important step in finding effective long-term solutions to these problems, ones that can trace their origins to our nation's shameful history of slavery and anti-black racism. As Professor Charles Ogletree of Harvard Law School noted, and he spoke to a committee of this committee years ago, the concept of reparations does not necessarily mean payments to individuals, but rather a focus on the poorest of the poor, including efforts to address comprehensively the problems of those who have not substantially benefited from integration or affirmative action. Once again, I commend the chairman, the sponsor, all members who are co-sponsors, and President Lincoln and General Sherman, and I urge the party of Lincoln to rise up to the calls of President Lincoln and General Sherman to do right. I urge the committee to support H.R. 40 and to report it favorably to the House. I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. I now recognize myself for purposes of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk will report the amendment.
amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 40 offered by Mr. Nadler. Strike all that follows after the
Without
enactment.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered as base text for purposes of amendment. I will recognize myself to explain the amendment. H.R. 40 was first introduced by former Chairman John Conyers more than 40 years ago. That's the nature of the amendment. More than 30 years ago in 1989. Since its initial introduction, it has only been amended once to reflect advances in historical research around the topic of chattel slavery and legal developments on the issue of reparations. This amendment in the nature of a substitute further amends the findings and purposes of H.R. 40 for the same reasons and provides technical amendments to the sections establishing the commission to conform it with more recent legislation that similarly has created legislatively based commissions. The underlying goals of the legislation remain unchanged, and I urge all members to support the amendment. Are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose is Ms. Jackson-Lee seek recognition?
To strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to be able to speak in support of my legislation, H.R. 40, which I introduced, that establishes a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, and as well pay acknowledgement and tribute to the Honorable John Conyers, who introduced this legislation in 1989 and entrusted its continuation to me as he retired. I took that challenge seriously, and here we are today, marking up for the first time in the history of the United States of America any legislation that deals directly with the years and centuries of slavery of African American people who are now the descendants of those Africans. I want to thank my colleagues for their persistence and joining me in this legislation, both Mr. Nadler, Mr. Cohen, and all of my colleagues who are here today. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, thank you for understanding the pain in which this body of people have experienced. And I ask my friends on the other side of the aisle, do not cancel us tonight. Do not ignore the pain, the history, and the reasonableness of this commission. This is a governmental commission, a commission that establishes the parameters of a study that provide the roadmap for the truth of the brutality and the onerous and terrible burden placed on African Americans and this nation by slavery. I hold in my hand the Constitution, which did not hold us as a whole person in its founding, even though we know that the opening statements in this Constitution says, we ask and expect to create a more perfect union. H.R. 40 is to answer that question of perfection. It's to answer General Sherman's point about 40 acres and a mule. It is to answer the imploding of the Reconstruction that fell on the backs of our ancestors through Jim Crowism and segregation and brutality. It is to answer the question of now some 4,000 of lynchings that occurred, with the predominant number of them, as we will discuss throughout this process, that were African Americans. It will discuss the Social Security legislation by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that for 2 decades, African Americans were not able to participate in large numbers, or redlining that undermined creating wealth, which of course evidences the fact that the wealth gap between white Americans and African Americans is as enormous today as it was in the 1960s. The terror of white violence against African Americans continued well into the 20th century, with historians marking the 1981 Ku Klux Klan lynching of a 19-year-old Michael Donald, innocent in Mobile, Alabama, as a purported final lynching in America. It was supposed to end an era of horror. But look where we are today. A lieutenant in the United States Army brutalized because of the color of his skin, for it seems no other explanation. A young man lost his life just recently in Minneapolis, and the George Floyd trial proceeding in Minnesota as well. Where are we today? Harvard University study indicated that if reparations had been in place before COVID-19, peer review, that there would not have been the numbers of African Americans who got sick, who got infected, and died from COVID-19. Though critics have argued that the idea of reparations is unworkable politically or financially, their focus on money misses the point. The goal of this historical commission and its investigations to bring American society to the new reckoning with how our past affects the current conditions of African Americans, and to make America a better place to help and truly study the disadvantaged. Consequently, the reparations movement does not focus only on payments, but it focuses on remedies that can be created in many forms necessary to equitably address the many kinds of injuries sustained from the chattel slavery and its continuing vestiges. To merely focus on finance is an empty gesture. We're asking for people to understand the pain, the violence, the brutality, the chattelness of what we went through. And of course, we're asking for harmony, reconciliation, reason to come together as Americans. I always believe if you understand, you can act. We want to act today by passing H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does Mr. Owens seek recognition?
Ask to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Let's start off real quickly, kind of getting this record straight. Yeah, the 40 acres and a mule was a promise by the Republican Party. Promises kept until President Lincoln was killed. And then a Democratic president took over, Andrew Johnson. First thing he did is went down and took away the guns of the blacks who were given this property throughout South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. And then they came back and took away their property. The KKK, Democrats. Jim Crow, Democrats. And guess what? The KKK was actually eliminated in 1985 until Woodrow Wilson, Democratic president, decided to bring it back with Birth of the Nation that he showed in the White House. And a few years later, it was Democrats who burned Wall Street down, Democratic KKK. Slavery was and still is an evil. Whether it's 83 years of history in our nation, or the prior 3,000 years of history, or the presence today around the world. Reparation is divisive. It speaks to the fact that we are a hapless, hopeless race that never did anything but wait for white people to show up and help us. And it's a falsehood. It's demeaning my parents' generation, that one of the greatest generations in the history of our country. We have a history of millions of middle class and wealthy Black Americans throughout our 20th century who achieved their dreams. Instead of a theory, I'd like to share the reality of a race whose history of success in America has been stolen, and what we can do to repay that damage. I grew up in the Deep South, Tallahassee, in the 50s and 60s, where we believed in commanding respect, not begging or asking for it. We did that by meritocracy, by winning, not just in sports and entertainment, but in every discipline: math, science, exploration, innovation, farming, enterprise. We had a reputation, as the Asian community today has a reputation of winning, respect. That was the Black community back in the 60s. We led our country in the growth of the middle class, led our country in men matriculating from college, led our country in men matriculating from college, from men committed to marriage over 70%, and percentage of entrepreneurs over 40%. That 40% equated to 50 to 60% of Black Americans across our country, from New York to Tallahassee to Texas to California, part of the middle class. I grew up in that middle class in the 50s. And believe me, they were not sitting back waiting for white people to give them a break. They were making it. I remember Perkins Service Station, Speed Grocery Store, Baker's Pharmacy, FAMU Hospital, where only Black doctors and nurses worked. We were taught about pride in our country, pride in our race. We were taught about Christus Addis, the first American martyr who died in the Revolutionary War, the Tuskegee Airmen, and over 100,000 Black men who fought the wars against the godless ideology of Marxism and socialism and communism. Those same ideologies now thriving in our educational institutions. We were taught to recognize and appreciate progress. Said 1973, entered the NFL, no black quarterbacks, middle linebackers, free safety, because those are white thinking positions. 40 years later, we're now electing a president of the United States as a black man, vice president of the United States, a black woman. And we say there's no progress. Only those who say there's no progress, those who do not want progress. The greatest gift that we had with President Obama was our American people saying, finally, we can close this chapter. Finally, we can move forward. And what have we done since? That has divided us even more, with critical race theory being introduced around the same time. We have a community now that lives the American dream, look around this room and see the middle class that we have developed and more. And yet we tell those who are striving to get where we are that they can't because white people won't let them. That to me is treacherous, it's traitors. For us to tell others who want the American dream that they can't achieve it because other people with a white skin won't let them do that. If you want to repay the black American community, give us back our history. It was Karl Marx who said, the first battleground is rewriting of history. And that's exactly what's been happening. You take away our history, you take away pride in our past, appreciation for our present, and a vision for our future. And that's what you're seeing in Chicago, Baltimore, Ferguson. Every place Democrats oversee a black community is misery. And we're gonna blame white people? How about an ideology? How about we take ownership? Educate our young people again. Give them jobs, opportunities again. Tell them that the way to get in this country is through free market. Allow them to take away the regulations, allow them to run their own businesses. Don't burn down their businesses every year because a white police shoots a black person. When you have black people, 93% of the thousands of black people being killed are by other black people. Crime is a true issue. And with that being said, we are not a hapless, hopeless race. We're just like everybody else. Give us a break and we'll make it happen. Stand back and you see how great our nation, our community truly is. Give us an opportunity. We'll get that done, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Correa seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I fully support H.I. 40, and I would point out that this study does not go far enough. America is a great nation with strong democratic institutions, free enterprise, and strong civil rights and religious freedoms. Yet we as a nation have lived through some very dark times. H.R. 40 addresses one of these dark moments, which is slavery. This bill is about making our nation a greater place for all to live. I would also draw your attention to another dark time in our history, the repatriation of the so-called Mexicans during the Great Depression or the 1930s. During the Great Depression, individuals that appeared to be Mexican citizens were rounded up, put in railroad cars, and deported. And among them, many, many US-born citizens. And this is a personal issue for me. My father, my aunts, uncles, all US-born citizens grew up in Mexico. They were repatriated to a nation that was not their own. And ladies and gentlemen, history has a way of repeating itself. Today, about 1 million American-born citizens, children, are growing up in Mexico. Again, another side effect of our mass deportations. And it is important that we step back and look at our immigration policies holistically. And it is critical that we address immigration policy and immigration reform in the context of justice and due process for all Americans. Again, Mr. Chairman, I support H.I. 40, and I hope that other studies are undertaken to remind us of these types of historical injustices so that we may address them and not have to repeat them. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Who else seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Roy seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, first, I would very much like to associate myself with the gentleman from Utah and his fine words that he shared with the committee. And I would offer that I think this is the wrong path for the future of our nation. Chief Justice Roberts, I don't always agree with, just for the record, I think put it very well in one of the Voting Rights Act's cases from around 2005 when he said, quote, "This divvying us up by race is a sordid business," end quote. I think he is right. And I think that is the problem here. And I think this is not the direction we want to carry our country forward. One of my heroes that I grew up learning economics from, unfortunately passed away last year, Walter Williams. And I learned a lot reading Walter Williams. I unfortunately never took his class. He taught at George Mason. I went to the University of Virginia. But Professor Williams has written a lot on this issue, extensively. He shaped some of my views on this issue. I'd take great deference in trying to listen to Black Americans on this subject and people who've experienced things I haven't experienced. But as Professor Williams discussed, and here I'm just quote an article he wrote about this a few years ago, he noted, quote, "Slavery," and it's all a quote from him, "Slavery was a gross violation of human rights. Justice would demand that slave owners make compensatory reparation payments to slaves. Since both slaves and slave owners are no longer with us, compensation is beyond our reach. Absent from the reparations debate is who pays. Don't say the government, because the government doesn't have any money that it doesn't first take from some American. So which Americans owe Black people what? Reparations advocates don't want that question asked, but let's you and I ask it. Are the millions of Europeans, Asians, and Latin Americans who immigrated to the United States in the 20th century responsible for slavery, and should they be forced to cough up reparations money? What about descendants of Northern whites who fought and died in the name of freeing slaves? Should they cough up reparations money for Black Americans? What about non-slave owning Southern whites? On Black people's side of the ledger, thorny issues also arise. Some Blacks purchased other Blacks as a means to free family members, but other Blacks owned slaves for the same reason whites owned slaves, to work farms or plantations. Are descendants of these Blacks eligible, deserving of reparations? There's no way that Europeans could have captured millions of Africans. They had African and Arab help. Should we haul representatives of Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and Muslim states before Congress and demand they pay reparations? By the way, is there anyone prepared to make the argument that Blacks in America today would be better off? Reparations advocates make the foolish, unchallenged pronouncement the United States became rich on the backs of free Black labor. That's nonsense. Slavery doesn't have a very good record of producing wealth. Think about it. Slavery was all over the South and outlawed in most of the North. Buying into the reparations nonsense, the antebellum South was rich and the slave-starved North was poor. But the truth is just the opposite. In fact, the poorest states in the regions of our country were places where slavery flourished. The reparations movement would do little more than amusing sideshow were it not for the damage it can do to Blacks. It misallocates time and resources that can be more fruitfully spent elsewhere. And he goes on to talk about the $22 trillion that have been spent in LBJ's so-called Great Society and the utter failure that has been the result of that money spent since the 1960s. We have utterly destroyed Black families. We have utterly ripped fathers and people that children should be able to look up to in their families from the homes of Black families in the name of government paternalism. And that, I'm afraid, is where this kind of legislation takes us. It takes us away from the important dream of judging people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. It takes us away from the dream that we are supposed to realize as Americans and the greatness that this country realized in taking a nation that laid out the principles in 1776, and 1787, and 1789, and in a mere 80 years, in the context of the history of mankind, reversed the horrors of slavery through the Emancipation Proclamation and through the blood of Americans who then fought and died for the premise that we should recognize the reality that all men are created equal. That is, I think, the danger of going down this road. And I would very much caution against going down this road of even a commission, much less where that might take us beyond that. And with that, I would yield back.
For what purposes does the gentlelady from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Oh, Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank you specifically, the Honorable Sheila Jackson Lee from the great state of Texas, for your longtime leadership on this legislation. You know what? I hope everybody understands that this legislation is about understanding. Understanding the full extent of our history, our policies, our laws that have consistently failed African Americans. We have to take a look at that. We have to reckon with it, because if we don't, we will never move beyond it. Hasn't this year taught us that? Our nation's history of racism extends well beyond slavery and black codes and Jim Crow, segregation, the horrors of our lynching history. It extends into our structures and to the systems that continue to perpetuate inequalities today. We see it even today. I acknowledge these terrible wrongs in our history and the shameful role our federal government has played in these wrongs. We must, with recognition, continue to figure out and study and understand what the injuries are and to find remedies. That is our lot, that is our burden. Studying remedies to this history is what H.R. 40 is all about, and the shameful role our federal government played in these wrongs. As Congresswoman Jackson Lee says, this is not a symbolic act. It is a path to restorative justice. You know, my faith guides me in aspects of my work, and all of us have a moral responsibility to fix the brokenness of slavery, to fix the racist policies that have followed. We have an opportunity here to set a new course for our nation, to finally meet the promise of our nation's founding. I remember, as Reverend Eugene Taylor Sutton, the Episcopal Bishop of Maryland, said when he appeared before us in 2019, he said, and I quote, "We are not yet fully the beloved community that God intends for us to be," end quote. The study and the development of reparations proposals could reveal remorse, atonement, reconciliation for our nation's original sin, and bring us closer to a more equitable society. As I said in the beginning, it most importantly might bring us understanding. This study and its subsequent actions is long overdue for Black Americans, but really not just for Black Americans, it's for all Americans. I'll end on the notion of a woman that I just revere, the story and the life of Sojourner Truth. She renamed herself as a freed woman, Sojourner Truth, a traveler for the truth. And it was she who lobbied presidents and senators and members of Congress for some sense of remorse and reparation. Let us learn from her journey and her story and her famous speeches, "Ain't I a Woman," among them. Sojourner Truth, a traveler for the truth, taught us long ago that we must face our history in order to be healed from it. And with that, I thank you, Madam Chair, for all your work, and I yield back.
Madam Chair, Madam Dean, would you yield your time to me?
I would love to yield to you.
Thank you. Let me thank you for that gracious and graceful acknowledgement of your faith in what we're really here to do. And I do want to just quickly say that each of us in this room have personal experiences. As we do this legislation, each of us will take pains not to personalize whether or not we are successful, our families are successful. That is the basis of this commission, to be able to look globally at the issue of slavery as the original sin and the brutality of it, and to then take the journey that looks at the stark disparities in the African-American community. I hope in this moment that we will not take the opportunity to point blame or to cast any actions of racism as one party or the other. It was America's sin, and that's what we hope to address. Just factually, let me acknowledge that Congress passed and President Lincoln signed a bill that paid reparations to the owners of slaves in the District of Columbia. We're not going down a pathway that has never been traveled before. I started out by saying, let us not cancel each other tonight. Let us not have a cancel culture, but a open-mindedness. I also want to acknowledge my friend and colleague again as I yield, and that is the Honorable Barbara Lee. Her legislation, H-Con Res 19, complements this work of restoration. With that, I want to recognize Mr. Shabbat for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This country's history relative to slavery and the subsequent legalized discrimination, Jim Crow, was antithetical to America's founding ideals that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable or unalienable rights. As we have been reminded over the last year or so, much work remains to be done to improve race relations in this country, including between the government and the people it's intended to serve. Unfortunately, this legislation would only set those efforts back. No one alive today is responsible for the harms inflicted by slavery in the United States, a practice that ended over 150 years ago. Further, as a nation of immigrants, our population has exploded since the barbaric practice of slavery was ended. Our population at the outset of the Civil War was just over 31 million, and it must be noted that a very large portion of those individuals did not own slaves. 30 years later, as immigration into the U.S. began to surge, our population had more than doubled. And 30 years after that, in 1920, the population stood at over 106 million, more than 3 times what it was 60 years earlier when slavery ended. While immigration has ebbed and flowed since the early 20th century, there has been a steady influx of immigrants into our country ever since, and we've discussed a lot of that today. Most of it legal, but obviously a significant portion has been illegal, but nonetheless, today our population, the official population, stands at over 330 million people, and I would again remind folks that there were around 10% of that back when slavery ended. Consequently, there's a massive portion of our population of every race and ethnicity whose ancestors never set foot in this country while slavery was legal. Forcing those whose ancestors immigrated to the United States after the abolition of slavery, or who worked to end slavery, or who died during the Civil War trying to end that practice, it's just fundamentally illiberal and unjust. Quite simply, no one should be forced to pay compensation for what they have not done. And that's what slavery reparations would do. Paying reparations would amount to taking money from people who never owned slaves to compensate those who were never enslaved, imputing the guilt of those who owned slaves or who aided and benefited from the institution of slavery to every non-African American in the United States would harm the country in many ways. Instead, we should be looking at improving the fortunes of all Americans, especially those in economically disadvantaged circumstances. We could start by making sure that all of our nation's schools, for example, are opened safely, but opened. And I would conclude by just noting, and I know that the chairman is not here right now. We obviously have an acting chairman here, but the chairman was asked by our ranking member a little while ago whether it was accurate or not that he was going to be introducing legislation along with some other folks relative to the Supreme Court, packing the Supreme Court. And I think the American people have a right to know if that's being considered. We know that last Friday, we're talking about a commission here, we know last Friday another commission was announced by President Biden putting together this commission on the Supreme Court. Another Democrat tried to do this almost 100 years ago, FDR, and even as popular as he was unable to do that. But the Democrats today are apparently so drunk with power here in Washington that they're going to give it another try. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think it could tear this country apart as well, just like this
Will the gentleman yield? I can answer your question about packing the court.
I don't really, I've only got 30 seconds left. and
okay.
Go ahead, real quick.
Yeah, I mean, the party that packed the court are the Republicans who jammed through nominees and refused to consider Merrick Garland.
Yeah,
So if anyone's
reclaiming
packed the
my
court,
time.
it's been the Republicans.
Reclaiming my time, I'm shocked that you would make that accusation. It's packing the court as clear as the day. It would be bad for the country, it would be bad for the court. I hope you don't decide to go ahead with it, but you just might. And I think we got a right to know whether you're actually going to do it or not. And that was a simple question that was asked. We think you ought to answer it, but apparently you're afraid to tell us.
Gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The institution of slavery is America's greatest sin. The enslavement of more than 4 million human beings between 1619 and 1865 nearly destroyed our nation, and its impact continues to be felt to this day. These effects remain because slavery and discrimination were enshrined in our founding documents, in the courts, and in our elected leadership. The Constitution of the United States, which established and guided our democratic system of government, counted African slaves held in bondage as only 3/5 of a human being. The Supreme Court furthered this dehumanization in Dred Scott versus Sanford, which declared the protections of the Constitution did not apply to African Americans, regardless of whether they were enslaved or free. At least 12 of the first 18 presidents of the United States owned slaves at some period in their lives. It took civil war and the near destruction of the United States to end the practice of slavery, but even that did not bring full freedom to those who were enslaved. For decades thereafter, African Americans endured forced segregation, racial violence, and denial of voting rights, and some of that continues today. Throughout the 20th century, federal government programs that helped build the middle class purposely excluded African Americans, further institutionalizing segregation and discrimination. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was established under the New Deal to create housing opportunities for middle and middle class families. The agency, however, refused to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods, a practice known as redlining, for the color codes used on maps to indicate areas it was, quote, safe to insure mortgages. The FHA also subsidized the construction of white neighborhoods and required that the homes that were built not be sold to black families. During World War II, many African Americans joined the military with the belief that their service would be honored when they returned home from fighting for their country. The GI Bill was transformative in providing tuition assistance, job training, and unemployment benefits to service members returning home from Europe and the Pacific, and it played a significant role in building the middle class in post-war America. The law was drafted, however, in a manner which allowed states to control the distribution of veterans' benefits, resulting in black veterans in segregated cities and states being denied the benefits of the GI Bill. Unemployment benefits were provided on the GI Bill for returning service members searching for new jobs at home. African Americans who had learned advanced job skills in the military were often only offered low-wage, low-skilled jobs when they returned home. When these highly skilled workers refused these low-wage jobs, they were denied unemployment benefits for refusing the only jobs offered to them. When the interstate highway system was built in the 1950s, it connected the country and revolutionized the nation's economy, similar to the railroad system in the 19th century. Many of the highways, however, were built in the middle of black neighborhoods, with many black-owned homes being taken over by the government through eminent domain. And in addition, black communities were often further segregated when highways were built along racial zoning lines, creating physical barriers between white and black neighborhoods. A full right of American citizenship only came after decades of struggle by those who carried on the civil rights movement and risked their own safety in search of an end to racial discrimination. And we should recall our beloved late colleague, John Lewis. Despite this, our country still lives with the lingering effects of slavery and official racism that has harmed African Americans. Since the 1960s, the wealth gap between black and white households has more than doubled. According to the Washington Post, the most recent data available shows that it would take the combined net worth of more than 11 black households to equal the net worth of one average white American household. Last year, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention released a study that showed infant mortality rates in the U.S. had broadly declined, but they remained twice as high for black infants as they did for white infants. In our education system, school districts that serve predominantly black and brown populations receive nearly $23 billion less in funding than predominantly white school districts. These disparities will never be fully addressed until we're able to acknowledge the great historic wrong committed against African Americans. H.R. 40 provides acknowledgement that a grave sin was committed against Black Americans, a stain on the soul of America. This commission will be empowered to recommend ways in which we as a nation can address these wrongs and ultimately make amends for them. This can include a number of different approaches, such as community investments, improving delivery of healthcare, and strengthening housing and educational opportunities. I want to acknowledge the great work on this legislation by our colleagues on this committee, particularly Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee for her leadership. And I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. I encourage all my colleagues to support this bill, to help our country heal and do what is right. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Goldman, is recognized for an amendment.
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 40 offered by Mr. Gohmert of Texas. On page 9, after line 23, insert the following and
The amendment will
redesignate.
be considered as read.
Well, I
Gentleman
would
is
ask that it
recognized.
be
for
read.
Pardon?
I'd ask that it be read. I object to the waiving of the reading.
Gentleman objects. The amendment should be read.
On page 9, after line 23, insert the following and redesignate all that follows accordingly. G, when the Democratic Party should be responsible for any compensation awarded, since it is the only relevant entity in existence today that supported the institution of slavery. This support includes, but is not limited to, the following actions: Democratic Party platforms in the 1800s that advocated for the institution of slavery, the Democratic Party leading a 75-day calendar filibuster against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a member of the Democratic Party, Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia, a known recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan, leading fellow Democrats in their opposition to civil rights for African Americans, Democrat enactment and enforcement of Jim Crow laws and civil codes that forced segregation and restricted freedoms of Black Americans in the United States.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment.
Thank you. During my time on the felony bench, one of the saddest things that I would ever see would be the effects of the sins of parents upon children. Countless times at the end of a trial, or a sentencing, I would have the child come up and make sure they understood this was not your fault. You should have no guilt feeling. This is not your fault. The most quoted book in the House and Senate during the entire history of Congress has been the Bible. And one of the things I love about it is the effort to avoid punishing children for the sins of their parents. And yet this is what this appears to do. We've already seen the results, as my friends have already indicated, of Democratic parties or policies like in New York City, Detroit, Chicago, San Francisco. They got an awful lot of bailout money. We've seen the damage that's been done, and we don't need to do more damage. We're about $29 trillion in debt. We don't have the money to be paying reparations. So if there is an award of reparations to people that were not slaves by people who had no slaves, then it will be grandchildren from now that will be punished and have to pay that price. But the truth is, at the rate that we're going, the degrading, the downgrading of our credit worthiness during the Obama administration by Standard & Poor's will start happening by others, because we will have shown ourselves to have been untrustworthy when it comes to spending. We could not control it. I've seen the documents where my great-grandfather signed when he came from Europe in 1870. I know there was horrendous wrongs done. Slavery is wrong. It's wrong for the 40 million or so that are being held in slavery right now. But if we look at the history The Republican Party was against slavery. The Democratic Party platform of 1840, 44, 48, 52, 56 supported slavery. And in fact, the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 that required law enforcement officers to arrest potential slaves just on the word of one person is outrageous. And yet that was supported in the Democratic Party platform. The Virginia 1902 Constitution was engineered by Carter Glass, who was a U.S. representative and senator, even Secretary of Treasury under Woodrow Wilson. He exclaimed, discrimination, why, that's precisely what we propose. In 1912, Democrat President Woodrow Wilson's administration began a racial segregation policy for U.S. government employees, and that was also followed up by Democrat President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He also, according to the American Journal of Public Health, prior to his presidency, Roosevelt not only banned blacks from receiving treatment at his polio facility in Warm Springs, but he required black staff to live in a basement of the facility. In 1964, the Democratic Party led 75 calendar day filibuster against the 64 Civil Rights Act. And there were 96 House members, Democrats, that voted against it. And that goes on. And I know some say, yeah, but then the racists in the Democratic Party switched parties. One did, Strom Thurmond, but if you go back and check, there may have been 3 House members that changed parties, but the 96 House members that voted against it, the senators that voted against it and fought against it, including Robert Byrd, most of them did not change parties. They stayed in the Democratic Party. So if we're going to force this on anybody, it ought to be the one party that has done so much damage. And that's why I would submit this amendment. If we're going to punish children for the sins that even their parents didn't do, then this ought to be the way to do it. I hope that we won't compound some horrendous sins by punishing great-grandchildren of people that did wrong. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I will yield myself the time in opposition. I started this debate by indicating that frivolity, cancellation culture, I would hope would not be the route that we would take, and that we would have a thoughtful discussion on the question of the original sin and the deeply embedded issue of racism and the prolonged impact on African Americans, the descendants of enslaved Africans. I maintain that now. Let me specifically put in the record the report of the Equal Justice Initiative that indicated more than 6,400 documented racial terror lynchings of African Americans in America occurred since the end of the Civil War, 84% of all lynchings. An additional 1,297 white individuals were lynched during this time, many for sympathizing with the African American cause or for being outspoken against lynching. So one can see that there has been an ongoing journey. I don't imagine as those individuals were lynched that they were able to ask any questions about party affiliation, regional location, wealth, or otherwise. They were brutally lynched. Now we come to an opportunity where that journey of brutality and racism and discrimination can be responded to with a significant civil rights initiative, a commission that will factually base its results and recommendation to the United States Congress on facts. And as we proceed in this debate, I will share those facts. But again, as we know, police, for example, they started by being assigned to catch runaway slaves. We know in this society, law and order is important. I support law and order. But we also know that we've seen a trajectory of the loss of life of African American males and women in the unfortunate circumstances that we've seen over the last couple of years and beyond. And so what we need to do here is to take each of these tragic incidences and look to a commission that can thoughtfully and thoroughly, academically, be able to address these facts. Might I just say to my good friends, interestingly enough, as President Johnson laid his pen down in the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he said, "I know we have just lost the South, and all of those Southern states turned Republican." I'm not here to make that charge. I am here to say, work with us, recognize the reality of slavery and its brutality and its continuing impact, even as we discuss the issues of immigrants, even as we discuss the issues of unaccompanied children. Look at the long-stated impact of this question of the divide in our country and the issue of racism as it impacts many groups. I know that this commission that will set a standard of study and academic research will make an amazing difference. And with that, I oppose the gentleman's amendment. I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Tennessee at this time, the chairman of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The amendment in question says that the Democratic Party should be held responsible because it is the only relevant entity in existence today that supported the institution of slavery. That's absolutely false. There are relevant entities in existence today that supported the institution of slavery other than the Democratic Party, like the states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama,
Well,
Georgia,
gentlemen, yield.
Florida,
They're
North
not
Carolina,
political parties.
South Carolina, and Virginia. Those states had laws that supported slavery, that supported segregation, that held African Americans down for years. So if you want to get down to this nitpicking and saying who should be responsible, it should be the southern states that are most responsible because they held these laws on the books for years to have separate water fountains, separate facilities, separate everything until the Great Society came about and changed it with the Civil Rights Act. And there were religious institutions that supported slavery and argued that the Bible held that there should be slavery, there should be separation of the sexes, and that there should not be miscegenation laws because of the Bible. So if you want to get down to it, it's not the party, the Democratic Party, which has changed and supports civil rights and African American opportunities. It's religious groups and the southern states that are most responsible. You want to accept that as an amendment, Mr. Gohmert, and have them be the people who pay the reparations? Book it. I yield back.
Who seeks recognition?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Iapolo is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank you for your tremendous leadership on this issue and so many others, and I thank you for bringing this bill forward. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I just can't help but say you really seem to not get this. Let me just be clear, this is not about punishing. The point is not that the current custodians of the fruits of exploitation are wicked and need to be punished. This is about reparative justice, restorative justice. It is about acknowledging that we who sit here do not have rights of ownership that are distinct from the history of slavery from which these rights were obtained and which those rights were denied. If slavery is wrong, as even you say it is, and if you through your history benefited from that wrong that was done, then you must be willing to commit yourself to righting that wrong. I believe that we must dismantle racism, white supremacy, and inequality in all of our institutions to create justice, to ensure equality and opportunity for all, and end the racial wealth gap. And to do that, it is essential that we establish this commission to study and develop reparations, and that we support my colleague, Representative Barbara Lee's commission on truth, racial healing, and transformation. My colleagues, let us be real about this. Often the story behind the development of our country focuses on a warming tale of early settlers building their path towards the American dream, for hard and honest work. But it's not a complete view, and it's a dangerous view that erases the undeniable history behind our country's success. The enslaved ancestors of today's Black Americans built America to what it is today. And yet we have continued to see this false retelling of history as recently as the previous administration's creation of the 1776 Commission to romanticize and diminish America's relationship with slavery and deny the federal government's role in enabling systemic racism. That could not be further from the truth, which is why I fully support this bill and this commission. For near every problem that America faces, Black families are more impacted than white families because of slavery's legacy. This is true for health outcomes, where Black Americans are more likely to have inadequate health care and underlying conditions, seen clearly in the Black death rates for COVID-19 being twice the rate of white Americans. It is true in policing, where Black Americans are twice as likely to be unreasonably stopped and 3 times as likely to be killed. But for a strong example of the impacts of endemic racism and anti-Blackness, look no further than the racial wealth gap. Before and after the 13th Amendment, Black Americans have had either zero or just a small portion of their labor returned in the form of wages. Instead, America, through slavery and systemically racist policies, withheld and amassed a massive fortune off of Black labor. A fortune so massive that it would take more than 200 years for Black households to reach the amount of wealth that white American households have today. And yet some believe that Black Americans should simply lift themselves up by the bootstraps, as if white Americans didn't benefit from government policies like the New Deal that created the white middle class. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said it best. The Homestead Act gave land to white citizens who came here voluntarily, but not to freed Black people who came here without choice. The GI Bill helped white veterans obtain college degrees and job training, but so many Black veterans who made equal sacrifices were not eligible for any of its benefits. And coupled with redlining and other discriminatory practices in housing that denied African Americans from qualifying for affordable mortgages, the federal government excluded Black Americans from paths to home ownership that the majority of the country enjoyed. Now, to be clear, there is nothing wrong with government policy that helps people access opportunity, but I cannot intentionally exclude Black people and others deemed unworthy. And the federal government has had that ongoing role of propping up racism against the Black community, and therefore has a responsibility to make reparations. We all do. A check will not undo the harm preventing Black families from being truly equal and free. And that's why this bill establishes a commission to examine the policies that brought us here and what policies would need to be enacted to effectively address longstanding disparities. Policies that will help everyone, but disproportionately, hopefully, help Black people, like universal health care or free college or a wealth tax. Only when we can face the horrific role of slavery in our country and its enduring policies can we begin to make up for the tragic harm of failing to prevent systemic racism against Black Americans. And that is why I am so strongly in support of this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it as well. Thank you, Madam
Gentlelady's
Chair. I
time has
yield back.
expired. Mr. Johnson of Georgia is recognized for, Mr. Owens of Utah is recognized for 5 minutes.
I look forward to taking the next couple of weeks and educating the American people about the success of the Black community. Because actually, to be honest with you, being raised by a community, a proud, entrepreneurial community that believed in meritocracy, that when they were told they could not succeed, they doubled down to prove that whoever doubted them were wrong. And to be honest with you, this concept that Black Americans have been used, abused, and discarded by white people is bothersome to me. I don't know if you guys heard what I said, but the 40s, 50s, and 60s, take this, please take this a note. And by the way, I lived during this period. So I'm not talking hypothetical. I remember these communities. I remember the pride when I didn't meet white people until I was 16 years old. I never thought of looking down on our race as hapless, hopeless, and not able to overcome. We led the country in the growth of the middle class in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Led the country in men matriculating from college in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Led the country in men committed to marriage, over 70%. By the way, that's now 70% of our men will not commit to their families. And business ownership, 40%, we're now down to 3.8%. You know how we began to succeed? We did it the good old American way. We believed in faith, family, the free market, and education, period. Now we believe in government. We have more people working for the government percentage-wise, and then people realizing that they can go out and build their business, their dreams. And this is what bothers me when we stand back and watch these black communities being burned down every single year. These are men and women that said, I'm gonna take my chance, I'm gonna take a risk, I'm gonna get out there and make things happen and serve my community. And some mistake, someplace, we sit back and allow their business be burned like nothing is wrong with that. And guess what, guys? These businesses across this country, nobody's rebuilding it. The billions of dollars given to Black Lives Matter, nobody's building these businesses back, giving these people their dreams back. I'm looking forward to, by the way, reparation. When you take people's money that they've earned, it's punishment. It's theft. It's judgment. It's saying that because of your skin color, you owe me. That is not the American way. We're not racist people. This American country is based on meritocracy. And I tell you, anybody who's been in sports or military, you guys get it. At the end of the day, it's the character, it's resolve, it's the loyalty that makes the difference. The color of skin has nothing to do with how we choose those people that we want to trust and move forward with. I'll just say this as I wrap this up. I do look forward to taking the next few weeks to educate the American people about my great race. One I'm so proud to have been raised in. A race that when I left my little community, the third black to go to the University of Miami, I went there knowing I can get a degree in biology because my parents expected me to succeed. My community expected that of me to succeed. And whether it was my teachers, my coaches, the business owners in our community, they expected our young black boys and girls to leave that community and make them proud, make their family's name proud, and overcome all obstacles that they were facing. It's the American way. And by the way, that's what all cultures were doing during that day. We need to get back to that. So we will find a way, during this process of discussion reparation, to finally educate the American people what's not being taught in our school system, that this is the greatest country in the history of mankind, and no place in our world can the black community, Hispanic community, Asian community, and I don't care where they come from, can live the American dream like here in this country. So let's not divide us up by looking at our history and having people feel guilty for something they ever did. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of HR 40, and I want to commend the tireless efforts of you, my dear colleague, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, for your hard work and dedication in bringing HR 40 to this historic precipice. There's no better time to take a comprehensive look at reparatory justice for Black Americans after over 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, apartheid, systemic racism, now Jim Crow 2.0 with Georgia's new voter suppression law. I'm a proud co-sponsor of HR 40, not just because it is long overdue, and not just because it's the right thing to do. I'm a proud co-sponsor because I have constituents who remember what the world was like when they lived in a democracy in name only. We still live today with the vestiges of slavery and the Jim Crow era. Slavery indeed was ended 150 years ago, but racism never took a day off and is alive and well in America, as demonstrated by the Confederate battle flags that so defiled the United States Capitol just a few months ago, January 6th. Just look at the arcane restrictions on voting, which were passed into law recently in my home state of Georgia. Or you can ask the family members of Dante Wright, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, or George Floyd, or a whole host of others. Black folks in this country cannot keep living and dying like this, but will be forced to do so if white folks in America continue to refuse to look back at history and acknowledge that while Black folks continue to suffer from the vestiges of slavery and the legacy of systemic racism, while that's happening for us, white folks continue to enjoy the legacy of white privilege. By the way, white privilege is bipartisan, and it inures to the benefit of white Democrats and Republicans. The legacy of slavery and the soil of its justification, racism, exists within every facet of this country. In fact, racism and her cousin, white privilege, infest the soil that has sprouted this country that we call the United States of America. In fact, slavery is our nation's original sin. Slavery is a crime against humanity, and so is racism. And it's a crime we have yet to reconcile as a nation. So HR 40 gives us a chance to reflect on our shameful legacy of slavery while painting a clear path towards redemption. This legislation strikes at the heart of structural institutional racism in the United States of America. And as a country, we've led the way by calling for other nations to reckon with their forefathers' sins. So it's time for us to do the same thing. While this legislation cannot change the ills of the past, it can lead us to a brighter and more inclusive and equitable future. Reparatory justice can put us on the path to healing. So that's why we should all be in favor of HR 40, which will study reparation. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Jeffries.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your leadership and for recognizing me and for ushering us to this historic moment. I also want to lift up the name of the former chair of the House Judiciary Committee, John Conyers, who of course carried this legislation for decades. America is a great country. We've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And systemic racism has been in the soil of this land since 1619. Now, this country was born with high ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equally. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The land of the free and the home of the brave. Liberty and justice for all. America was founded on high ideals. But at the same time, there was a birth defect, a genetic imperfection on the question of race that took the form of chattel slavery, one of the worst crimes against humanity in the history of the world. So no, we're just not simply going to move on. And some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to take the position that after 246 years of chattel slavery, an amendment is passed, my bad, get over it, move on. No, we will not. We're not going to move on from slavery, from rape, from kidnap, from subjugation, and from oppression. We're not going to move on from the fact that the Reconstruction effort was short-circuited. Yes, we were promised 40 acres and a mule when General Sherman signed Field Order 15 in Savannah, Georgia, because the view was that land acquisition, the land that those slaves had worked for centuries, should be part of empowering the newly freed slaves. But guess what? That order was almost immediately rescinded when Lincoln was assassinated and President Johnson took over. So instead of 40 acres and a mule, many African-American communities have been given 40 acres and a blunt. So no, we are not going to move on. We're not going to move on because the Freedmen's Bureau that was set up to empower newly freed slaves was closed after 9 years in 1874. Why? Because fraud and incompetence and criminal behavior. Nobody was held accountable. 50 white trustees, tens of thousands of freed slaves lost their life savings. So no, we're not simply going to move on. We're not going to move on because after slavery, Jim Crow and the rise of the KKK and the lynching epidemic and Plessy versus Ferguson and Black Wall Street in 1921 destroyed. Why? Because black prosperity was viewed as a threat to white supremacy. So no, we're not simply going to move on. And when the Great Depression struck, African Americans were hit the hardest and we received the least amount of support. Why? Because yes, Southern Dixiecrats insisted that in the New Deal, African Americans would be excluded, while other Americans were helped. Excluded from Social Security, because most of us were domestic workers, or many of us, and agricultural workers, excluded from Social Security, excluded from unemployment insurance, and excluded from the federally subsidized loans and insured loans that were issued. So between 1934 and 1962, 98% of the federally insured loans that were issued by the federal government were issued to white Americans. That's how suburbs were created. So no, sir, we're not simply going to move on. We're not going to move on because with respect to the GI Bill, more than 1 million African-American veterans were systematically excluded from its benefits. When they came back from war, just like everyone else, built the great American middle class. So we're not simply going to move on. We're not going to move on because in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, which effectively ended in 68 and 71 mass incarceration, and the war on drugs started disproportionately targeting African Americans and Latinos. So yes, this is a great country. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. We're not perfect, but we're marching to a more perfect union, and that's what HR 40 is all about. The least we can do is study these historic wrongs. That's the least that this Congress can do. I yield back.
Mr. Liu is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee. I serve an active duty in the United States military because I believe we are an exceptional country. And one thing that exceptional countries do is we recognize the harms that we have done and we try to correct them. You know who understood this? President Ronald Reagan. He signed a law that gave reparations to Japanese Americans who were interned. He gave money to Japanese Americans based on race. And I've heard arguments by my Republican colleagues tonight. President Reagan would have rejected all of them. And I ask that you read his speech on August 10th, 1988. I'm going to read you some portions of it. He starts by saying, "The members of Congress and distinguished guests, my fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. More than 40 years ago, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. The action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race. For these 120,000 were Americans of Japanese descent." And then later on, he says, "The legislation that I am about to sign provides for a restitution payment to each of the 60,000 surviving Japanese Americans of the 120,000 who were relocated or detained. Yet no payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. President Reagan did this for an evil, un-American act that didn't even rise to the level of slavery. He was taking money from taxpayers not even born in World War II and giving that money to Japanese Americans. That wasn't theft. That was one of the shining moments of American history. He didn't dishonor Japanese Americans, he honored them. And for those of you, those Republicans at this committee who can't even vote for a bill that sets a commission to look at this issue, I urge tonight for you to look in a mirror and ask yourself, how did you fall so far away from the standard that Ronald Reagan set? Yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone seek recognition? Then I'll recognize the gentlelady.
Madam Chairman?
The-
Madam Chairman,
Yes, who's seeking recognition?
McClintock of California.
Mr. McClintock of California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. You know, history offers us an inexhaustible supply of grievances and injustices that are powerful enough to stoke hatreds and resentments that can tear any society apart. That's what this bill is all about. It is evil in its effect, if not in its intent. This is not reparations for those responsible for slavery, paid to those who were enslaved. This bill contemplates something radically different. Holding people of one age responsible for the ills of another based not on their conduct, but on their race. Lincoln often pointed out that our country was born into a world where slavery was an established institution. The American founders reviled it, and they placed principles in our founding documents that they were confident would ultimately place that evil institution upon the course of ultimate extinction, and would ultimately produce a republic where men and women of every race and every background could together enjoy the blessings of liberty. Equal justice under law means a colorblind society where race simply becomes irrelevant. And until recently, we had been making tremendous progress toward that vision as a nation. Now, it's true that very damaging and unwise policies have disproportionately impacted Black communities. Union-dominated schools that have utterly failed to educate the children of the inner cities. Welfare programs that have made fathers irrelevant. The withdrawal of police protection from inner city neighborhoods. These are certainly among them. But these policies devastate every community where they're practiced, and the answer is to change those policies, not to excuse them because they're ideologically pleasing to the left. This bill addresses none of these current ills. It instead attempts to set neighbor against neighbor and American against American solely on the basis of their race. You say this is healing. It is precisely the opposite. The biased composition of this commission lays its intent bare for all to see. It's designed to reach into the dead past, revive its conflicts, and then reintroduce them into our age. I think all Americans of goodwill, regardless of their race, have had enough of this nonsense. So please stop. It's tearing our country apart. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Let me yield to the gentlelady from Missouri, Congresswoman Bush, for 5 minutes.
Oh, Father God. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak. First of all, I will say that we are not children. So telling folks that have endured something that you have never endured to stop anything is absolutely uncalled for. The systems of trauma caused by the enslavement of Black people in this country, it's not history. Those systems are ongoing and they are vicious. That trauma, science tells us, and we're talking about science, is intergenerational. The pain endured by our ancestors lives in our DNA. Look it up. In the stories we know about the horrors faced by enslaved Black people of African descent and their families. in the material world we live in, where descendants of people who were enslaved endure historic levels of inequity. The painful reality is slavery isn't just a Southern problem, it's an American problem. I'm not from the South. I'm from Missouri, a former Midwestern slave state. St. Louis, my district, was the very place where Dred Scott, a free man, was denied the fullness of his humanity because he was Black. St. Louis has been the site of auction blocks and slave patrols, broken people, broken families, broken communities, and to this day, we continue to suffer in slavery by another name. We are over-criminalized still, over-policed still. We are under-resourced. Some want us to believe that slavery is a long past history, but its vestiges are alive today, generation after generation, in Black communities all across this country. If we removed the impact of every single dollar garnered from slavery, every bale of cotton, every pound of tobacco they harvested that you actually benefit from, where would this country be? Who would have these buildings we can now sit in so comfortably in a building that some of you are seated in right now? And to the Republicans who are against this legislation, how dare you? How dare your nearly all-white panel spend so much energy and abuse your power to deny justice for the descendants of one of the most egregious atrocities in the history of the world. You will not deny our families stories of being separated, sold, because I got that story, sold, I got that story, raped, I got that story, lynched, I got that story in my family, and beaten into submission, I got that story in my family, and not just me, so many other Black Americans. So how dare you? Some of my colleagues are trying to argue that the South is economically impoverished and therefore could not have benefited from slavery. But that is not only disingenuous, it is outright wrong. The entire country benefited from slavery. The North took the rich harvest from the South and made thread that was then exported across the world. The South harvested cotton that made the United States one of the most prolific exporters of cotton. Come on now, talk about the history. Us as lawmakers working in this chamber are benefiting from the free labor that built this very capital. And so I'm going to ask you, unless you can come with those stories about what happened, the lynchings and all that your family members went through, unless you can talk about those stories of rape, unless you can talk about those stories of how your folks worked and did not receive the wage, your folks, because let me say this, we're not talking about folks that lived around the corner. We're talking about folks that were stolen from their actual land, lost their culture, lost their languages, lost their stories, were separated from their families, all to work for ancestors of folks that look like some of these folks today that are on this call that are opposing this. So let me remind you, you have no idea what that is like. You don't know what that's like, but the least that you can do is support research. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? The gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like any other difficult subject and long-standing, there's no question there's complexity here that we won't settle now or if this commission comes to pass in this commission. But I think it's good that we make the record as complete as possible. The gentlelady from Missouri made a lot of interesting points, and I think sometimes those points are made without even the speaker knowing it. When she said, till this day, the damage continues to be done. Till this day, Black people are still essentially accruing the debts that would be part of reparation. If that's the case, then one of the challenges for Madam Chair and everyone else is, does that mean that not the descendants of slaves, but anyone who feels that they're being somehow treated ill under this society should be part of this reparation? And will this commission study that? Now, there were a lot of things said about the post-slavery period, and many of them were true in the way of African Americans being second-class citizens. But I know that a former congressman from my district, Dalip Singh Song, born in India, came here and experienced prohibition on land ownership, prohibition on elected office, prohibition on citizenship as under the Asian Exclusion Act. Should each Indian or descendant of them also be added to the list of these grievances? They certainly have as much merit, although Dalip Singh Song rose to be a judge and rose to be a member of Congress. His story, before he became a successful figure, was one of infinite education, amazing talent, and obstacles that were completely unfair that had tripped over so many of his fellow countrymen. And the list goes on. I think that the challenge with this idea of a commission is that although many of the authors and supporters have essentially already decided that reparations are due and said so, they've already decided the outcome of the commission. They simply want the commission to effectively rubber stamp a decision and put a number on it. But I assure you, or predict, that the road that you are considering, if you're able to go down it even a little way, will become a tangled web of different routes, twisting and turning, none of them leading any predictable decision. Because even taking, for example, our vice president is a descendant of a slave owner from Jamaica. Our vice president is half from India. And our vice president identifies as an African American. How will that be calculated? And is there any way to calculate that the way we calculated the direct damage that President Reagan signed and paid for those people, those specific people who during their lifetime or immediately following to their immediate descendants were adjudged for, and an amount was paid based on what was done to them by a specific act of our government. I think for President Reagan, it was not a difficult decision, but I would predict that he would take a very different tact if asked to try to calculate percentages of people unborn at this time and not in the United States. That it was not the case with the Japanese Americans, and what President Reagan did, we all can and should honor. So the comparison was made, but the comparison actually begs the exact question, which is, can you calculate it? And if you start down this road, are you in fact going to calculate how much those who came afterwards owe to those who were not there, and how much is owed by those who identify today as being persecuted to this day? Are reparations continuing to accrue? And I would say, based on the conversations we've heard here today, the answer would be yes by many of the proponents. And with that, I thank the chair and yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word, and I'll yield to the chair in a moment. I just want to respond, first of all, to our colleague, Congresswoman Bush from Missouri, and thank her for her really powerful testimony or statement to the committee. And I think it's important to recognize there are a set of lived experiences that many of us have not had, and that we have to pay particular attention to leaders in the African-American community whose families have had many of the experiences and live with many of the consequences of institutional racism and the legacy of slavery in this country. To my colleague from California who said, what about other people who've been, as he described it, treated ill? We're talking about something quite different than being treated ill. We're talking about 4 million people, human beings, who were enslaved, who were beaten, robbed of their freedom, robbed from their families, robbed of any kind of future, and were treated as property. Anyone else who's in that category should surely be part of this commission. But the notion that others who might have been treated ill are the same, this is about a very specific history in this country that we have to confront. And I listed a whole bunch of policies. Those weren't the fact that they were slave owners. Those were policies of our government that discriminated against African Americans. We have the power to respond to that. And a commission might say, for example, because of your racist policies, including blacks from Social Security or from housing, we should double up or triple up our investments today. That would be a responsible response to government policies. We all own that. We benefited from that as white people in this country. And so this notion of like, I wasn't a slave owner, I've got nothing to do with it, misses the point. It's about our country's responsibility to remedy this wrong and to respond to it in a thoughtful way. And this commission is our opportunity to do that. And so I just urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, open your minds to this. The commission might make a recommendation you can support, but what's the harm in studying it and presenting proposals for our consideration? Doesn't the African American community deserve that at least? And so I ask you to vote for this resolution. I yield the balance of my time to the chair.
I thank the gentleman. I understand, Mr. Cicilline, that Ms. Loughran is trying to seek time for a...
Thank you, I yield to Ms. Loughran.
We yield to Ms. Loughran. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to give this perspective. When Chairman Conyers, then Ranking Member Conyers, spoke to me about this bill a long time ago, I thought, well, what's this got to do with me? You know, my family, they were immigrants. They weren't here during the Civil War. They had nothing to do with slavery. And I just didn't understand why that was fair. But as time went on, I understood something different. My dad was the son of an immigrant. He didn't get to go to college. He was in World War II. And after World War II, he didn't get to go to college, but he got a GI loan to buy a little tiny house. It was a $9,000 house, $89 a month for 30 years. And having that house built wealth for his family. And when I learned that African American veterans of World War II, they didn't get to buy the little house like my dad did. And so people my age who are African Americans, they didn't get the wealth building that my family had. And so it's not about, you know, who's to blame, because my father certainly wasn't to blame. It's about who was denied opportunities and how do we look at making sure that everybody in America is being treated fairly. That's what this commission is about. And I think it's important. We don't know what the answer will be, but I do know that I benefited from a set of policies that I didn't even know existed. And my children did, and my age peers and their children were disadvantaged by policies. And so let's take a look at that. And let's see what we can do in America to have a fairer, more just society that remedies past wrongs that we may not even have known about, understood, or designed, but that we benefited from. And I thank the chairwoman for allowing me to offer these few comments and yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Rhode Island yields back. And the gentleman,
Madam Chair.
Mr. Buck, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and I yield to my friend, Mr. Owens.
Let me set the record straight. I've been hearing this about the GI Bill for quite a while. Let me kind of make sure everybody, and by the way, all you have to do is look it up, guys. You can look this up. My dad came back from World War II. Growing up in Texas, he could not get a postgraduate degree. He graduated from Purview, but because of Jim Crow laws, I ran across a box of letters after he passed away, rejection letters from across this country that would not accept him. And I knew it was because of his color, because he was a very, very smart guy at that time. But you know, they used that as motivation when people said they couldn't. So what he did is use this GI Bill to go to Ohio State, where he got his PhD in agronomy. His brother used his GI Bill to get his PhD in economics. My mother's 6 brothers got their GI Bill, college taken care of, and they all became part of the middle class. I lived in Liberia, Africa, 5 years old, during the days of segregation, because my dad was doing research in Liberia, Africa. I had an uncle that was an engineer, an older uncle, engineer, decided he was going to start a second business. So he bought a plane in 1960-61 and took mail from Wichita Falls, Texas to Chicago. Now, I don't know how many people you guys know, how many white people you know that had bought planes, and it wasn't that he was rich, he just had a dream. And my first flight, around 10 or 12 years old, was because he flew to Tallahassee and took me up in that little single-engine plane. So I think we need to learn our history, my friends. No, we took advantage of the GI Bill, and we became the fastest growing middle class because we came back, built our homes, built our communities, had our kids going to college, graduating with big dreams. Well, I'll tell you one thing for sure. I'm going to wrap up with this. What a difference in messaging when I was growing up and now. For my parents to tell their kids they could not succeed because of white people would never have happened. I mean, seriously, they would be so disappointed in the messaging we're giving our kids. Because no, they were not getting the fairest treatment. But boy, they were so proud of who they were. They were going to make sure that they commanded respect by doing everything you had to do to overcome anyone, any racist. By the way, one last thought. I got my degree in biology at the University of Miami. You know what drove me? My senior year in high school, this white guy said I couldn't do it. You know what that did to me? 4 years I lived in that library in the University of Miami, lived there, because I was going to make sure that guy was so wrong. That was the commitment. That was the way my race was taught. We need to get back to that. Let's stop telling our kids they can't succeed. What examples are we to tell our kids, I can do it, but you can't? Instead, let's tell them this. It's tough. You're going to fail. Everybody's not going to believe in you. Some people might not like you, but you can do this. You live in the greatest country in the history of mankind. If you go out there and you run harder, you work harder, you study harder, you can succeed in this country and make good things happen. I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Who's that?
Reclaiming my time, I yield to my friend from Texas.
Well, I would just simply like to ask my friend from Utah a question, because earlier he had said that, and had observed the change and the flip in families in the black family unit and divorce rates going from the most married with fathers at home to now inverted. That is not the case. Does my friend from Utah have thoughts and a view on what transpired that caused that, and that what resulted in that?
Absolutely. It's called policies. Policies. The last 4 years, the policies put in place by the Trump administration had the lowest unemployment in the history of our country for blacks, Hispanics, Asian women, and veterans. We had over 400% increase in black business ownership. Policies makes a difference. And I'm going to tell you this, I've seen what happened to my community, the great community I grew up in, and look back and see what's going on now. It's policies that's doing it. And you go to every single place where there's misery in our communities. It's because of college policies in which our kids are not being taught how to read and write. They're not taught, the family unit's been turned upside down. They're not telling our young men to respect, to love God, country, family, respect women and authority. That's what I was taught. We get our kids thinking that way again. Our men will man up, take care of their families, and families move forward. And that's actually how we become a very successful community. Our families have to get back together again, and policies that destroy the family unit, destroy a free market, destroy our opportunity to have our faith in our God. Those policies will destroy our culture, and we can't allow that to happen. I yield back.
I thank the chair, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair. I tried my best not to weigh in this evening because we should not have to, but I grew up in the South. I've served as a career law enforcement officer, and I gotta tell you, every time I think I have heard it all, I come to Judiciary and get enlightened. My father was a janitor who went to work 7 days a week to make ends meet. My mother was a maid. And let me say this, I'm blessed that I was able to make it. But I cannot forget about those who did not. And I certainly cannot forget about those who continue to struggle. Madam Chair, I thank you for your leadership. I also thank you for all of you who have recognized our dear friend and colleague, the late John Conyers. I thank you, Madam Chair, for continuing his extremely important work. You know, what I have heard, it's just, I can't believe my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are serious, but unfortunately, I know they are. I've heard just about every excuse in the book. I've heard it's too hard. Figuring out the numbers would be too difficult. Well, I do believe, I agree with Mr. Jeffries, we are a great nation. And I do believe that we can do just about anything we have the political will to do. America has solved some of the most complicated, most challenging issues because we've had the political will to do it. What I've heard, Madam Chair, is that this is horrible. What happened was horrible, but we aren't going to do anything about it. And Madam Chair, you so graciously said that this is America's sin. We're not pointing the finger at any particular family or individual. Some may feel guilty, but this is not about guilt and this is not about punishment. This is America's greatest sin. And let me remind us all, guess what? We are Americans. And as legislators, I do believe our job every day is to find ways to correct America's wrongs, find ways to make America better. And that's to give everybody, every man, every woman, every boy, every girl, regardless of the color of their skin, an opportunity to succeed in this great nation. For those of you who are trying to convince yourself that the ill effects, the pain of slavery certainly couldn't have any effect on us or my parents' generation or even my grandparents' generation is just simply ridiculous and absolutely shameful. 4 million individuals, and look, guys, we have this amazing opportunity to do something big and meaningful. 4 million human beings. Slavery, but the ill effects of it, still the ghosts in the room. I know it every time I look at voter suppression laws. I know it every time I hear about redlining and other anti-discrimination efforts and policies and laws that are in the process of trying to be passed all over this nation. I know it's a difficult subject, but we need to face our fears and face the realities. If we are who we say we are as Americans, do we want to forget families that were broken apart, people who were hung, dragged, raped? I've heard time and resources. It would take too much time and too many resources. That is just downright shameful. I've heard Democrats are drunk with power. Well, guess what? That's what slavery was all about, power. I've heard if you're going to force something on anybody, well, guess what? That's exactly what slavery was all about. We're asking to form a commission that will take a look at correcting America's greatest sin. Again, Madam Chair, I thank you for your leadership, and I ask my colleagues to support the bill. I certainly do not support the legislation coming from my member of, the amendment coming from my colleague from Texas, but I do support the bill. So with that, Madam Chair, thank you so much, and I do yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I'd just like to reiterate to, once again, to our Republican colleagues that this legislation only relates to studying the root causes, that substantiate, this country's need to be able to repair the glaring inequities, the societal inequities that communities of color still are faced with each and every day. And that's just what I wanted to say. And at this time, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to our esteemed colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
I thank the gentlelady for her leadership. I can't sit here and listen to my friends, even with the spirit in which I came to this markup. No cancellation culture, America marching together. But when someone in this room calls this evil and it will bring about evil, I cannot accept that. I am offended by the accusation that a simple commission embodied with commissions created by Congress over the decades, that frankly is not a commission about a check, which the minority insists on reducing the commission's study of reparations to, taking money from those who never owned slaves and give it to people who never were slaves. Not only does this grossly misrepresent the commission's task and its approach to the study of reparations, it ignores several facts known to everyone participating in this markup today. The Centers for Disease Control just declared racism as a public health issue. I want to submit that report into the record. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman.
That objection.
Simply put, Americans who were never involved in slavery continue to endure, or Americans who were never enslaved continue to endure racial stigma of slavery, African Americans that is, and the lasting economic and social harms caused by decades of legally enforced racial discrimination. That is what I'm saying, my friends. This plight that we will be studying is government-created slavery, 3/5 of a person, right here in the Constitution, only because of the 13th Amendment were we made whole. Only could we vote because of the 14th and 15th Amendment. You cannot deny that. That stigma creates and continues itself. It continues itself with African American offenders receiving sentences that are 10% longer than white offenders and are 21% more likely to receive mandatory minimums. Education, 57% of Black students have no access to a full range of math and science. It is crucial that we study this continuing, lingering debasement of, yes, bright and generous-hearted and loving Americans. Has anyone heard the phrase, you lift one boat, you lift them all? My good friend from California, Mr. Correa, mentioned the plight of Mexicans in this country. We're not unfamiliar with the indigenous Native Americans. And listen to what Ronald Reagan said. This is not about a check. No payment can make up for those lost years. So what is most important in this bill has less to do with property than with honor. For here we are, admitting a wrong. Here we are affirming our commitment as a nation to equal justice under law. That is what this commission is about. It is not about our personal historic stories. My father was one of the most outstanding comic artists on Madison Avenue in New York. Ezra Clyde Jackson But when the young man came home from World War II, with all of his genius, his works now in the Library of Congress, he was summarily dismissed. I want my father's name to be in this. H.R. 40 is a concentrated effort to right a wrong and to do it with dignity and study and respect. I have listened to my friends. I would never suggest that I would understand whatever history you might have had if you were Irish American, fleeing the famine in the 1800s, or the treatment of Italians in the early part of the 1900s. But one thing about all of those groups, they were able to translate into the American virtues and the American dream. Today, young people languish without that dream. Why is that? That is the question of this commission. It is to study and develop a structured response, remedies to what is going on. So let me simply say this quote. Say this quote from President George W. Bush, and that is, a great nation does not hide its history. It faces its flaws and corrects them. He was speaking about the Museum of African American History and Culture. He said, it tells the truth that a country founded on the promise of liberty held millions in chains, that the price of our union was America's original sin. I can't imagine why any one of us would not vote for H.R. 40, the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals, and I ask my colleagues to vote yes on this bill and against the underlying amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there any further amendments? Are there any further speakers on this amendment?
Mr. Chairman, could I ask unanimous consent to have two articles submitted for the record? Topics been brought up in National Review and The Hill, The Myth of Nixon, Southern Strategy, and Democratic Party History.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The question occurs on the amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? No. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted. Are there any further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? For what purpose does Mr. Johnson seek recognition? The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 40, offered by Mr. Johnson of Louisiana.
I would reserve a point of order at this time.
Page 14, line 24, insert, quote, if any
Without
dispute...
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The point of order is reserved. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It says very clearly and simply, if any dispute arising from a contract awarded under this section is appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, the appeal shall be heard and decided by a Chief Justice of the United States and 8 Associate Justices. We are prompted to bring this necessary and clarifying amendment tonight because of the breaking and shocking news that developed here recently tonight that the chairman of this committee and others are planning to introduce a bill tomorrow to pack the Supreme Court. And since you and everyone else here have refused to dispel those rumors, we can take no chances with any legislation from this point forward without addressing this very important issue. The very idea of packing the Supreme Court is so dangerous to our system of government that we have to address it directly right now. Of course, this is not the first time the idea has been proposed. And I would assume that all the members of this committee are familiar with the history of the last attempt. After his landslide re-election in 1936, President Franklin Roosevelt wanted to pack the Supreme Court with new justices so they would uphold his New Deal legislation. The Democrat Party enjoyed huge House and Senate supermajorities in the 75th Congress at that time, but they rejected Roosevelt's plan. The Democrat-led Senate Judiciary Committee issued a report on the bill. I have a copy of it right here. It's still archived, and all of you can pull it up. I commend it to your reading. It concluded that the effort to pack the court would be a disaster. And quote, it said, its ultimate effect would undermine the independence of the courts and expand political control over the judicial department, unquote. Has anything changed in the last 8 decades? Of course it hasn't. The 1937 Judiciary Committee report continued, court packing is simply, quote, an attempt to change the course of judicial decisions by neutralizing the views of some of the present members, unquote. It is far better, the report said, that we await orderly but inevitable change of personnel than we impatiently overwhelm them with new members, unquote. If you pack the court now, it will destroy judicial independence and a basic foundational structure of our republic in a way that can never be restored once we go down this road. This government of, by, and for the people is still an experiment on the world stage, while we are still on our way to forming a more perfect union. And yes, we have sins in our past, but our Constitution, with its separation of powers, has served as a model for the constitutions of all the other nations on the earth. And we are, as a result, the most free, most powerful, most successful, most extraordinary nation in the history of the world. But we are only 245 years into this. Our birthday is July 4th, 245 years. And there are certain essential foundational principles that hold it all together. When John Adams, of course, was endeavoring to explain the difference between us and Great Britain, he said, we are a nation of laws, not of men. He meant by that the symbol of justice, Lady Justice, has a blindfold because justice is blind, and it says inscribed in the marble right above the Supreme Court building, equal justice under law. All that would be jeopardized if you packed the courts. The manipulation of the courts by the British Crown was literally one of the abuses that sparked the American Revolution. The Declaration of Independence lists the grievance, and our Constitution includes specific safeguards to prevent those abuses here. The founders of our nation, like Alexander Hamilton, wrote and warned that the independence of the courts is, quote, essential in our system of government. Do you want a small group of unelected people to become the chief legislative body in this country? For legislative and profound constitutional questions to be decided and reversed and decided again over and over and over with every election cycle and new president who wants to also add new justices to the courts? Can you imagine the very dangerous and unprecedented instability that this would bring to our justice system? This is such a radical proposal that even leading liberal scholars have vehemently opposed it over the years, and your Democrat predecessors concluded in previous generations that court packing would be madness. In more recent days, Justice Ginsburg opposed it. Justice Breyer gave a speech at the Harvard Law School just last week opposing it. He warned that public trust in the Supreme Court rests in the public's perception that, quote, the court is guided by legal principle and not politics, unquote. And he noted with great concern that there has been a, quote, growing public suspicion and distrust of all government institutions. Everybody on this committee knows that's true, and it ought to keep us up at night. I want to read just a brief excerpt from the Senate Judiciary Committee's adverse report to the New Deal legislation's Judicial Reorganization Plan, dated June 7th, 1937. And this is what it says. The Committee on the Judiciary, to whom was referred the bill to reorganize the judicial branch of the government, after full consideration, having unanimously amended the measure, hereby report the bill adversely with the recommendation that it does not pass. The committee recommends that the measure be rejected for the following primary reasons. It applies force to the judiciary, and in its initial and ultimate effect would undermine the independence of the courts. It violates all precedents in the history of our government and would in itself be dangerous precedent for the future. The theory of the bill is in direct violation of the spirit of the American Constitution, and its employment would permit alteration of the Constitution without the people's consent or approval. It undermines the protection of our system that it gives to minorities and is subversive of the rights of individuals. It goes on and on. It warns that this is a terrible idea. And yet here we are today. I urge support of the amendment, but even more, I invite the chairman and all of the other Democrats here to denounce this crazy idea clearly tonight.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. In the first place, the amendment says any appeal shall be heard and decided by a Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. Well, that's completely impractical, because what if one of the Associate Justices, one or more of the Associate Justices have to recuse themselves because for various reasons? That would violate the amendment. But in any event, and I would also point out historically that the Supreme Court, the size of the Supreme Court has increased in the past. President Lincoln increased the size of the Supreme Court. It's been increased and decreased from time to time. But in any event, I oppose the amendment. Because this bill is not the proper forum for debating this subject. It's not part of this bill.
Will the chairman yield to correct the history?
I yield.
So it was for 5 years during the Civil War, that's it. But since 1837, since that time, we've had 9 justices, and it served us very well. And everyone, every legal scholar of note on the left and right, throughout our history, and in all judiciary committees in the past, have acknowledged the wisdom of that number.
Well,
That's the thing. Now, if you want to change it, I'm open to amendments to changing the words of this amendment. If you want to say,
Reclaiming my time, the history is that the Supreme Court has gone up and down in size, but the real point is that this bill is not the proper forum for debating that. We'll have ample time to do that.
Mr.
Who
Chairman,
else does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I would just note that
I yield to Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just note that in the year 2016, for 11 months of that year, we only had 8 justices because Mitch McConnell refused to have a 9th justice. So we have not had a constant